Hey everyone, today I'm talking about In Freedom's Cause by G.A. Henty, and if you're watching this video, it's probably because you have to read it for class. But if so, lucky you, it really is an exciting historical fiction novel full of action, adventure, drama, and even a little bit of romance. In fact, the same events described in this book are the ones that inspired the award-winning film Braveheart. But I'm going to be honest with you, Chapter 1 is a little bit rough, and that's not just because of the 1800s vocabulary. Partly it's because we're missing the historical context. So what exactly is going on at the beginning of this book? When the novel starts, we meet Archie Forbes, a young boy living in Scotland, where his family used to have a castle and a whole lot of land. And I say used to because it was recently taken over by the Kerrs. So basically what happened is the Kerrs showed up, killed Archie's dad, took over all of his land, and only allowed his mom to stay there as long as she did her work and stayed out of trouble. How does that even happen? Why didn't anyone stop them? Aren't there consequences? Well, our author G.A. Henty tells us this: the royal power was feeble. In other words, there was a power vacuum in Scotland. There wasn't really a king or law and order to enforce things how they should be, and people like the Kerrs were able to get away with anything. So how exactly did Scotland get here at this time period? So these are the British Isles, or at least they're supposed to be, and this top part right here is Scotland, and the bottom is England. At this time period, I would describe Scotland and England as frenemies. They sort of got along and had treaties with each other. Oftentimes their children would marry each other to create political alliances with kings and queens, but they also had some differing political interest and would sometimes go to war with each other. So Scotland was its own independent nation. At this time, Scotland had a king named Alexander, and England had a king named Edward. All right, so here's Alexander. So he has 3 children. He has a son, draw the son, he has another son, and then he has a daughter. And through a series of unfortunate events in just a couple of years, all 3 of his children passed away, including his daughter who was living in Norway. So there was this question of succession. Who would take over when Alexander himself passed away? Well, there was one last hope. His daughter's daughter, or Alexander's granddaughter, if you can follow me. Her name was Margaret, and she was only 7 years old at the time, living with the other side of her family in Norway. So the plan was to bring her back to Scotland and arrange a marriage so she could become queen when she was old enough to take the throne. So this is before anyone had airplanes or anything like that, so Norway is somewhere off the map over in this direction, and the only way to get back to Scotland was to sail in a ship. And for this 7-year-old girl who was on this voyage across the sea, unfortunately, she became ill, very sick in fact. And while she was on the voyage, the 7-year-old girl, Margaret, ends up dying. So now the people of Scotland were saying, okay, well now what do we do? There's no one left in the family to become king or queen. Well, if you remember what I said earlier, there was often some intermarrying between Scotland and England, and many people in Scotland had ancestry in England and vice versa. So when there was this power vacuum on the throne, all sorts of nobles started coming forward and saying, hey, you know, I was the king's 3rd cousin twice removed if you go back, or hey, I'm the king's great-great-nephew, so I should really be the next one in line. And it's this huge mess until finally the King of England steps in. Edward. So let's see, I'm going to go ahead and draw Edward here. So here's Edward's plan. Edward says he's just being a good neighbor. He's going to come up to Scotland, and since he's heard they're having a hard time finding a king or a queen, he's just going to be like a temporary king until they can figure this whole thing out, just so things don't turn to chaos in Scotland. So he says, don't worry guys, I got this. Well, do you see the problem with the King of England calling himself a temporary king of Scotland? He's not exactly motivated to ever figure this thing out. And in fact, Edward uses this situation to effectively take over the country of Scotland without ever fighting a battle. And those who were in Scotland with some allegiance to nobility in England, like the Kerr family in our story, were able to get away with doing just about anything that they wanted to, leaving people like Archie and Archie's mom to suffer. But despite her quietness on the outside, our author G.A. Henty tells us that Archie's mom burned with the ambition that Archie should someday avenge his father's death and win back his father's lands. So our story picks up in chapter 1 after all of this has happened, and Archie's outside one day and he sees an English nobleman ride by with the Kerrs. And he goes and asks his mom about it, and he says, hey mom, what's up with that? How come the Kerrs are all buddy-buddy with the English? And how come the English act like they own this place? Isn't this Scotland? How come they think they're in charge? So she takes a deep breath and she answers him with this. You may well wonder, Archie, for there are many in Scotland of older years than you who marvel that Scotsmen, who have always been free, should tolerate so strange a thing. It is a long story and a tangled one. And that tangled story that she tells Archie is the one I just told you about King Alexander, all of his kids, and his granddaughter Margaret. And after Archie hears everything, he responds like this. But surely, mother, Scotchmen will never remain in such a state of shameful servitude. In other words, Archie is not happy about this, and just like the Kerrs have control of his family's land when they shouldn't, the whole country of England has control of Scotland when they shouldn't. So Archie makes a declaration that he's going to stand up for what's right, and he's going to fight for freedom. What happens after that? Well, you're going to have to read the story and find out.